Yeah, absolutely. In fact, as you know, you wanted to do this podcast after I wrote my most recent book, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, a Geopolitical Economy. And a central argument, I would say even the central argument of the book, although there are many, but this is pretty key to it, is to precisely understand neoliberalism, because my argument is that part of the reason why we have our countries perform so badly vis-a-vis the pandemic, why we are mired in this kind of war, which we are conducting, is a proxy war against Russia, and why we are destabilizing the whole of the world, the world order, basically, has to do with neoliberal financialized capitalism. This is the term I use, and I argue that it is most fully developed in two countries in particular, namely the United States and the United Kingdom, where the ills of neoliberalism have gone the furthest. So what do we mean by neoliberalism? And I'll come to financialization later, but what do we mean by neoliberalism? So basically, in general, neoliberalism is understood to be about free markets and free trade. So the idea is that neoliberalism advocates free markets and free trade. It is the ideology with which about 40 years ago, politicians like Ronald Reagan, Mrs. Thatcher, etc., came to power. They said that the problem in the world, the reason why we had a big downturn and a big recession, a stagflationist crisis of the 1970s, was because the government was interfering too much in the economy. It was important to roll back this interference and so on. And of course, by talking what they were referring to when they said governments were interfering too much in the economy, was they were referring to the post-Second World War order of what are generally known as Keynesian welfare states. So after the Second World War, we had welfare, most Western countries had welfare states. They heavily regulated capitalism. They imposed capital controls. There was substantial state ownership. Economies were managed to try to at least approach to full employment, etc., etc. So this was the case, and the neoliberalism was then about rolling back all of these and giving freedom to capital in order that it will sort of, the idea was that if you remove these restrictions, then capital would be free. So neoliberalism is supposed to be about free markets. But what scholars have argued is that if you look back at what has really happened, when you talk about, free markets and competition, in reality, what has happened is, in fact, neoliberalism have not freed markets. What they have done is they have essentially freed capital, and they have freed not just ordinary, what most people consider capitalism, which is a whole lot of competitive firms and so on, but rather they have freed giant monopoly corporations. So, and that also relates to why neoliberalism has not actually done what it says on the tin. That is to say, they have not revived the economies of the Western world. And what has happened over the last 40 years is that giving monopoly capital these kinds of freedoms has not restored the productive health of our economies. Because in general, neoliberalism refers to competitive markets. But we don't have competitive markets anymore. We have an economy which is dominated by big giant corporations who are not price takers, as we might say. They are price makers. So they have absolutely no need to respond to the pressures of competition and so on. So applying the neoliberal recipe to this kind of economy has not restored productive dynamism. And the only thing it has achieved is the financialization of these economies. You give capital freedom, they have no need to invest. They make more, and the profits that they make are not reinvested. So they productively reinvested. So all they do is they slosh around in this vast sea of money capital, in which basically you don't invest to produce things in order to sell them and then make profits out of it, but you simply want to make more money out of the money you have. So without particularly producing anything, Marx would say that Marx argued that the circuit of capital is you start with money, then you invest it, you buy commodities, you invest, and then you produce more new commodities which are worth more, than you sell them, so you get at the end more money than you had. Well, this is completely short-circuiting that process, and it is going from money to money without producing anything. So that's financialization. So what I'm arguing is that neoliberalism, and I guess I'll say one other thing. So, as an ideology, neoliberalism has, you can say neoliberalism really emerged more or less with the birth of what we know as neoclassical economics, one of whose, most of whose wings were actually very free market. You know, there was perhaps one wing, the Walrasian wing, which was not necessarily free market, but the bias was definitely towards free market. So it emerged in the late 19th century, but already by the early 20th century, you had massive critiques of neoliberalism. Keynes was, of course, the most important. So through most of the 20th century, you had the dominance not of this neoclassical economics so much as Keynesian economics. And then it's only after the crisis of the 70s and the onset of neoliberalism that this kind of free market, free trade mantra really got its historical moment. It was, embraced by policymakers, and it still remains, despite the fact that over 40 years, it has not achieved what it's supposed to achieve. Our governments have still clung to it. And the key for that, to understanding that, is that neoliberalism is not a theory, it's an ideology, and it's an ideology which favors big corporations who are very powerful. They can always find people who will come to power and implement the policies that give them more and more freedom, tax them less and less, and so on.
And one of the sort of the way this manifests isn't just like in debates between economists. It actually, this is the 50th anniversary of the Chilean coup and the overthrow of Allende, and you and I were both in Caracas, and we went to the foreign ministry, and we saw Allende's glasses on display, and it was a reminder to Hugo Chavez that they're not going to do to the Bolivarian project what they did to the Chilean project. And so can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think most people have this conception of imperialism as when one country invades another country, or there's sort of military competition, or we just don't like communists or we just don't like left projects, or that these people are dictators. What is the you said a neoliberalism is an ideology. And how does that ideology manifest in sort of foreign intervention?
Actually, that's a really brilliant question, because what it does is it focuses attention both on how Chile was one of the, in fact, the first kind of experiment in neoliberalism, but also why it was so. So let's begin with the first. So, neoliberalism as an ideology, like I said, through most of the post-Second World War period, it was sort of sidelined because the dominant persuasion was Keynesianism, and governments thought that they could use Keynesian economics and so on. And it was not that governments, they did this out of the kindness of their heart. The fact of the matter is that in the post-Second World War period, working class movements were very strong. They had mobilized over a whole century. They had acquired, of course, exceptional power during the wars, because if you want to ask people to go and fight for you, you have to promise them something. So in that sense, that was that empowerment. But neoliberalism sort of continued its existence at a subterranean level in these marginalized think tanks and so on. And in particular, by the early 70s, people like Milton Friedman in the University of Chicago were beginning to push it more and more energetically, particularly because the crisis of capitalism was upon the world. And so this was the opening through which they would sort of come through. So the coup against Allende in Chile was, of course, it was against a social democratic, some would say socialist government. So that makes sense. The United States is fighting communism everywhere, and we'll come back to that in a second. But the coup in Chile was essentially, as everybody now knows, as people like John Pilger have recorded in wonderful documentaries, that the USA was definitely behind it. They encouraged the coup. And it wasn't just that they wanted a government to take power, but they wanted the Pinochet government to implement neoliberal policies. Now, why do they want to implement neoliberal policies? Was it because Allende was a communist? I think really in order to understand the Cold War, the opposition to communism, you really have to put it in the larger history of imperialism. What do I mean by that? So basically, and by the way, some version of free markets and free trade has been the dominant ideology of most countries. So in the 19th century, when Britain was the most powerful country, it advocated free trade to everyone, right? Now, why is that? It's not that Britain always scrupulously practiced free trade. That is not it. It wants other countries to practice free trade. Why? Because essentially what imperialism needs and wants, apart from controlling societies and so on, what is the purpose of controlling societies, ruling them and so on? It is really to open up these societies to the interest, to capitalist interests from first world countries, from the imperialist countries. And this is very important to understand. You want to open up these societies. You don't want them to do what is really necessary, which is to practice various forms of protection and state direction in order to develop your economies. Because in the history of capitalism, we know that actually, contrary to the idea of free trade, the only way in which countries have developed is by actually not opening up, but at least selectively closing. We're not talking about autarky, but selectively closing your national economy, regulating the inflow and outflow of trade, inflow and outflow of capital, in order that you can develop your economy. Because if you simply open up your economy, what happens is that goods from elsewhere, which are produced more cheaply, simply flood your markets. Your own enterprises don't get a chance to produce and so on. And in the end, it doesn't work really for everybody. But imperialism always wants to open up economies, which is why some version of free trade has always been the dominant ideology. And this is why they wanted to impose that on Chile, because the Allende government had other ideas. They had the temerity to think that they could run the Chilean economy in the interest of ordinary Chilean people and to try to develop their productive capacity and so on and so forth. So in that sense, the purpose of neoliberalism, so the Cold War, anti-communism, so to understand that is where you have to understand that if governments must always intervene to develop their economies, as was seen, for example, in the development of countries like Germany or Japan, or even the United States in its early days, practiced massive state intervention in order to develop, because if they had not, the dominant country of that time was Britain, and British goods would have simply flooded all markets and not allowed those countries to develop. But by the early 20th century, you also began to see the emergence with the Bolshevik Revolution of communist attempts to develop the economy, so that, in Russia, it was not possible to allow capitalism to do it as it was in Germany or Japan or the US. So you now saw an alternative way of development, which also involved massive state intervention, and which, by the way, was stupendously successful. By the end of the 1930s, Russia had already become the second most industrial country in the world. So imagine that, and this was done without the privilege of imperialism. This was done even though most of the capitalist countries were trying to oppose Russia's industrialization. And of course, today we see that in the case of China. So I would say that the whole purpose of it, so essentially the anti-communism of the Cold War was also a form of imperialism. The point was that countries should not try to develop in this way. The examples of Russia and China should not be imitated by other countries. So the Cold War itself should be seen as a chapter in the longer history of imperialism.